Hello and welcome to the Mighty Oaks Show. My name is Jeremy Stallnecker, the Executive Director of the Mighty Oaks Foundation. Happy to have you with us today. And we have a guest here remotely, and I'm excited to talk to Jon Sanders. Jon is a career firefighter, EMT, and in addition to that, of all things, a pastor. And I always think it's funny when people say, and then I became a pastor, because that was my journey, and then I became a pastor. People always ask, how'd you become a pastor? Yeah, I don't know. I just look back and there I was. But it's good to have Jon with us. And Jon has a podcast, the Fire Inside podcast, and we'll put the link to that in the comments on our YouTube page, so you can check that out as well. But Jon is very interested in helping the firefighter community, the EMT community, first responder community, deal with matters of resiliency and overcoming many of the traumas and the stresses that community endures. If you follow our show and or listen to the podcast, the radio show, you know that this is something we talk about often. We recently had here in Marietta, our police chief and our fire chief on, and we talked about these issues. I think, and Jon, we can talk more about this, but I think this is an area that is misunderstood and overlooked. We talk about the veteran suicide rates and the veteran trauma issues and all those things. This is I think, nationally something we understand and something we are very familiar with. But when it comes to the first responder community, both fire and police and all that would be in that community, these are numbers we don't understand. And I think things that are not often talked about and overlooked. And we need to be more intentional about dealing with these things. So really happy to be able to talk to you. And you have an interesting story. And I'll let you introduce yourself, but kind of an interesting path to what would be considered full-time ministry. So Jon, talk to us about kind of what got you into fire service and maybe your upbringing a little bit and where you are now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to come on the show and
for sure.
Talk with you, man. I love what you guys are doing. So the Cliff Notes version to my story is I grew up in ministry. My dad was a pastor growing up. I was born in a little town in Minnesota. At an early age, I moved down to Peoria, Illinois, and grew up in a pretty solid home. I liked the ministry, but I knew it was not for me. Like growing up, my dream was to play professional football for the Minnesota Vikings. They never got that memo, never called me. Yeah, right. In high school, I really started to feel drawn toward the fire service. You know, I've always loved helping people, and I've always loved a little bit of the risk and danger that comes with, you know, anytime I saw the lights and sirens, I was always just drawn toward that. And so in high school, I really set my sights on a career in the fire service. And after I realized professional football, I probably should have a backup plan in case that didn't work out. And so I left high school, went right into, and by the way, I married young. One of my regrets in life is I kind of wish I had served in the military. There's been a lot of times I've thought, man, I should have signed up. But as a high schooler, I was like, I don't need someone telling me when to get up, when to go to work, when to sit down, when to eat. And then I got married at a very young age and found I had all of that anyway. So my wife hates that joke, by the way.
It would have been easier.
Yeah, my wife hates that joke. But I got married young. I was married at the age of 18. I was still a senior in high school. Growing up, my dad always told me, you know, hey, marry your best friend someday, which I thought, I don't want to marry Jeff Harriman. That's gross. But when I met my wife in high school and realized, oh, this is what he's talking about. Like, she was my best friend, and like, we're going to spend the rest of our life together. So at the age of 15, I walked into my parents' bedroom and I told them, here's my plan. I'm going to marry Jessica. I'm going to get a degree in fire science. I'm going to go to work for the Peoria Fire Department. And I'd like to start on all of that like now. And they were able to hold me off till I was 18 and I got married and I pursued that path. And at the age of 21, I got my dream job and got hired on the Peoria Fire Department, a full-time career department there in Illinois, and thought I had my life figured out for the next 30 years. I'll work this job. I'll retire at 51 with the full pension and still be young, and we can get back to the honeymoon and all of that stuff, right? But then the way I'd like to tell people is God kind of messed up my plans in the best way possible. Like, it really was a calling. A lot of times people will ask, how did you go from firefighting into pastoral ministry? And I assure you it was not my idea. And it's something I ran from. I really did. It was just a calling, and I can't really explain it any way other than that. It was something I was running from. I knew that's where God wanted me, was essentially preaching. And I did my best to suppress that call and run from it. But finally, at the young age of 23, I was just 2 short years into my career as a firefighter. And I surrendered. It was that moment of surrender where I just said, okay, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life running from this. God, if you want me in ministry, I think you're making a huge mistake. And I think you're going to live to regret this, but if you want me, I'll go. And it's a long story worth about 4 cups of coffee, how we got from the, Peoria, Illinois, out to this little town in rural South Dakota, which is kind of an unnecessary qualifier because all of South Dakota is pretty rural. But we moved out here. We left the fire service after 4 years. My family and I, at the time, it was just my wife and my young son and daughter. And we left Peoria to move out here and plant what is now called the Rescue Church. We're a non-denominational church with multiple campuses. But it's kind of crazy how my life came full circle, because I thought I'd be a pastor, now that this is what I'm doing. And a few years ago, God opened a door for me to go back into full-time firefighting in addition to being a pastor. And that was kind of a wild step in a career to take. But again, I felt like it was a calling. I felt like it was a gift he was giving me and offering me to step through that door if I wanted it. Yeah. And I felt, though, that this time around, it was about way more than just the job itself. I love fighting fire. I love being on the team. I love working with the guys and the gals on the department. But I knew that there was probably more of a ministry aspect to it. And it did not take long coming back into the full-time fire service to really have my eyes open to the need that exists in that community, which we can get into and talk about. But that's kind of a nutshell how I got from being a young guy, just getting started in the fire service, now being not such a young guy with a little bit more wisdom and experience under my belt, doing 2 careers that I love.
Yeah, that's incredible. Our stories are very, very similar that way. I ended up in the military, not the fire service, but was raised in a pastor's home. And I always kind of make the joke, the one thing you learn being raised in a pastor's home is that you don't want to be a pastor. I mean, that's right. That's the joke, right? And probably like you, it sounds like you. I didn't hate God or the ministry. I watched my dad work very, very hard to plant a church and to do those things, and realized this is not my calling. Mm-hmm. Ended up in the military, and then I just think it's worth pausing and saying, because I have these conversations a lot on the ministry side. We'll get to the fire side in a minute, but people will ask, how do you serve God, and how do you get into full-time ministry, and how do you do these things? And my story, and it sounds like your story, is the same. You just move through the next door that's open, and God then opens another one, and then you do the next thing. We try to plan it all out, but honestly, for me, it was that exact thing. I was in the military doing what I wanted to do, what I thought I'd do for the rest of my life, and I really felt the calling and took the next step.
Well, if I can share this, it's a part of my story that I love to share because God gets the glory. He's the hero of my story. And this is there was a pivotal moment of surrender. And as I'm a young guy, 21, 22, 23 is when I really came to that full moment of surrender with my life. Like up to that point, I was a Christian, I was a believer, I was a Christ follower, but I still was holding on to some things that I wanted. Like I thought I would write a better story with my life than God. Sure. When I was really getting to that point okay, I probably need to surrender, I had this thought play out where, and I have kind of a wild imagination, but I basically saw myself throwing up all these excuses to the Lord about why I'm the wrong guy for this. I'm not old enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not educated enough. I don't know what I'm doing. And I really sensed like God was kind of saying to me, like I didn't hear an audible voice, but I just sensed like God was saying to me, John, I don't need you to be anything enough other than willing and obedient. Like I don't need you to bring to the table a bunch of skills, because I'm the one that's limitless and all powerful. And I can show you what I can do through a life that's surrendered to me if you're just willing to step through that door. That you don't know what the next 3 steps are. I'm just asking, are you willing to step through this one? And some of those steps are much bigger than others, or at least they feel that way at the time. They feel huge and insurmountable. And for me, that was a huge step, because I knew with that was the implication that stepping away from the fire, like to surrender to that call toward ministry at that time in my life, I knew the implication was I will be leaving a job that thousands of people show up every year to test for and want. And I'm leaving a job that people just don't quit. So that was that felt at the time like a huge moment of surrender. I came to realize my only regret in it was I just wish I would have obeyed God even sooner, because again, he writes way cooler stories with our lives than we do when we surrender to him and just let him lead. So I kind of had this vision in my mind play out of, someday in eternity standing before God and him saying, look, I gave you the life you chose, and I'm a good God. I blessed you. You had a good life, but I want to show you the life I had written for you, if the story I had chosen, if you would have accepted it. And then this really big screen drops down somewhere from the ceiling and he plays the video, and it's like, look at all these people whose lives you could have impacted if you had just followed me, but you chose to be the boss and not let me totally have the reins. So that, again, I have a wild imagination like that, but that was kind of that summer of 2003 where I just kind of said, okay, I'm not running from this anymore. If you want me in ministry, God, I'll go. Again, I feel completely unqualified and like the wrong guy, but we'll see what you can do. So, and it's been a crazy journey ever since, like you said, just stepping through the open doors and leaning in where you feel like God's opening a door. So,
and I think this is important, whether your story is one of brokenness or maybe confusion or whatever. Understanding that God allows these pieces to play out in your own life so that you can use them for the benefit of others. I remember leaving the Marine Corps, going into ministry, and I mean, in a big way in my heart, feeling like, man, I just wasted the last, 15 years of my life when I decided to do this and started toward it and got in and did the things I did. And I don't understand how this works. And I end up pastoring and far away from a military community. And then God brings all of that back around to where now every day of my life is using ministry and the military and those pieces coming together. And we talk about this often on our show, is using your story for the benefit of others, using what God has placed in your life along the way, whether you thought it was important at the moment or not, and using that, leveraging that to help others. That's redemption. That's making something out of nothing or adding value to something you may have thought was lost. And again, that can be trauma. Maybe you have trauma in your life. You need to redeem that, use that part of your story for the benefit of others. Maybe it's just this, and trusting that God has a plan for your story that's bigger than your understanding of it, right?
Absolutely. And one other theme I'd love to hit on there just real quick. We, as Christians, we throw around that term full-time Christian ministry. And I know what we mean by that. We often mean like vocational, like you get paid to do that ministry. But I think that's such a dangerous connotation because it gives us this false dichotomy that there's like this separation between the sacred and the secular. And the truth is, if God's called you to be a soldier, that's a sacred calling and it's ministry. And if God calls you to be a firefighter, it's a sacred calling. There is no difference, where you get your paycheck from. So whether I'm getting up to come to the office or whether I'm getting up to go to the fire station, I see it all as ministry, and it's all sacred before the Lord. It really is, whatever your calling may be.
Yeah, that's right. I absolutely agree with that. I think the idea of vocational ministry is important. We need to have people who are paid to do ministry, but you're always in ministry. Yeah, absolutely. So you ended up, starting a church, pastoring a church. That's happening along with the fire service. When did you? And this may be I don't know. I'll let you answer. When did you start to look at what you're doing in the fire service and say, there's a problem here that no one is addressing? And there is. The numbers are incredible in terms of veteran suicide, or suicide in the first responder community. If the numbers were reported correctly, it's believed that nearly twice as many first responders killed themselves last year as were killed in the line of duty.
Yeah.
Many. Now, with 40% underreporting, it's still higher. The numbers are still higher of first responder suicides to line of duty deaths. And then you think about the divorces and the relationship issues and the drug and alcohol abuse and those things. When was it that you started to see it, but then realized this is a problem and someone needs to address this?
Yeah, well, my eyes were open to that very early, coming back into the fire service for the second time at a professional level, at a career level. So I had been kind of a little disconnected from that community for a few years as I was focused more on the church planting side of things. But as I re-entered that community, and it did not take long at all for those statistics to start coming to me and for people to start sharing. And again, just to observe, to sit back and realize that, yes, our profession is very dangerous. The physical nature of the job that we do claims the lives of many people on a yearly basis. but far more than that are dying by suicide and addiction and all this other stuff. And those are just the numbers we know about. A lot of times those suicide deaths don't even get fully reported or included in the reporting. So chances are it's even higher than what the statistics tell us. And again, really, you had mentioned veterans earlier. It's very much a lot of the same core issue. It's exposure to trauma. The difference between a combat veteran is they get most of their trauma in a very intense, short period of time. In the first responder community, we get a more spread out introduction to trauma just over the course of a career. It's not quite as intense as, day in and day out, but it's that continuous exposure to trauma, to loss, to human suffering, to seeing the absolute worst of humanity. And the truth is, as important as it is for us to talk about the safety in the physical tactics of our job, and we do that, we focus so much on our training, and that's good and important. The stuff that's really killing us is that behind the scene. It's where we try and cope with alcohol and substance abuse. It's the marriage problems that are, wreaking havoc in our life because we don't have a strong spiritual foundation in our marriages, and all that is the stuff that's killing us. The depression, because we've not been equipped. Well, quite frankly, not only have we not been equipped with the healthy tools for dealing with the emotional side of it, we've even been given the false dichotomy. We're told from the beginning, hey, you're heroes because of what you do. Right. And sadly, we believe it. We believe it. Like, yes, we are the heroes that rush in when everyone else is running away. And therefore, when we ourselves are in a place of struggling, we believe the lie that says, I don't ask for help, I give help. I don't seek help. I'm the one that offers it. And then we don't know what to do when we're faced with our dark days. And so it's prevalent. That issue is so prevalent in the first responder community, whether we're talking firefighters or paramedics or cops. It is real, and it's a present thing that we're dealing with in our profession.
I serve as a chaplain with our local fire department, and I've been asked a number of times, what's the difference between veteran trauma and the issues that veterans deal with, service members deal with, and what we deal with here at the fire service? And that's a hard question for me to answer. I just don't have the depth of background in the fire service. But in having those conversations, and then through Mighty Oaks, we have a first responders program, and we have first responders that attend our programs. So I've had a lot of conversations, and one of the kind of the contrasts to me is that if you've served in combat, even if you've served a number of times, as you mentioned, the trauma happens, it's very intense, and then you come home, and there's generally a period of time. It can be a long time between that trauma, you come home, you deal with stuff, and then the next time you might have to deal with something like that. In the first responder community, I feel like, it's at least my perspective or my perception, that one of the things that's difficult to deal with is the fact that you had trauma yesterday, you saw something traumatic or difficult yesterday, you had to deal with something yesterday, and then you went home to your family, and then you're going to do it again today. Is that something that, it seems like the long term of that would just be debilitating.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly it. That's the nature of it. The nature of our job is to show up in chaos, to fix a scene, and to close the doors on that and to move on to the next one. That's what we do. And again, it's this crazy thing that somewhat it's the things that are right about us as firefighters and as first responders that also can be our greatest weakness. So the fact that we can step into that mess and quickly deal with the situation and clean it up and move on to the next, that's a good thing. But the problem is those things start to compound, and over time, over the course of a career, and it sneaks up on us because none of us go into it thinking it's going to bother us or it's going to affect us. By the way, this is a unique insight. I just recently was talking with a mental health professional that was making this insight that 20% or so of the fire service really struggles with depression, according to her statistics. And she said, what we don't talk about, we talk a lot about PTSD and all of that within that 20%. She said, but what we don't really focus on is why do the other 80% of you not struggle with the stuff that you see? Why don't we focus more on the resilience in what is it about the majority of this profession that you do keep getting up day after day and going after this stuff? But that's the crazy thing about it, is what affects me may not affect you. And it could be the smallest thing that triggers a whole chain of events that then start kind of going back to this stuff that's in there. Our mind has seen things that we're never going to unsee. And it's just that one event, that one trigger. It might not even be job related. Many times it's not. Many times it's stuff within the marriage, within financial pressures, health issues. And all of a sudden we've got this library of stuff that probably hasn't been dealt with in an appropriate way. And now we've got a career's worth of trauma to try to unpack. And many first responders don't have the tools or even the know-how to realize that this is what I'm up against. This is what I'm dealing with.
So a couple of things. One, it's obviously better to deal with those things as you go, right? Not to wait 20 years or 25 years. What do you, as a pastor, as a chaplain, in your current roles, how do you counsel folks who are in that, they're early in their career, they're moving through their career, and they're dealing with this stuff every day? When you talk about spiritual resilience, you talk about, don't wait 25 years for this to pile up on top of you. What are you talking about? What are you telling them to do?
Well, there's really kind of two sides to that coin. There's the first side is the reactionary, how do we respond when we're going through something, when we're dealing with something? And that's where we would have the conversation about, it's good to talk about this stuff, where we come against the stigma that so often keeps us from seeking help, because again, I'm the tough guy, I'm the hero, I shouldn't need help. Yep. So it's breaking down that stigma. Let's talk about it. It's okay to acknowledge, hey, something affected me. We have a saying where we say it's okay to not be okay for today, right? Like that's okay. So that's the response to that. Like we have that, there's resources, EAP, there's counseling, there's that. But the flip side of the coin too is more of the preventative side, where how do we build a base of resilience so that moving forward, some of this stuff either doesn't affect us as bad, or we can bounce back a little quicker when it does. And for me, I try not to, I truly mean this, people aren't going to believe me because I'm a pastor, but I truly try not to like shove my faith down people's throat and preach Jesus to everybody. However, I personally, for myself, just speaking for myself, I don't know how I would get through so much of what I deal with in that line of work without a strong faith in Christ, because my faith, I've heard people criticize faith, and you plug in any name of faith that you want, right? But people will say, oh, religion is just, a crutch for weak people to get through life. And at least in the Christian faith, I'm not an expert in all world religions, but Christianity would agree with that and go, yep, like I need a savior, and I need someone who's strong when I'm not strong. I need someone who's faithful when I'm not faithful. I need someone who's perfect when I'm not perfect. And so I don't know how people that don't have that strong foundation of faith, a strong family life, and again, that takes work to build that. That doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly isn't going to happen. My marriage isn't getting better when I'm off at the bar and looking at porn in my quiet time. Like that takes work to cultivate that. But without that foundation of faith and a strong family, I would have crashed and burned a long time ago. So to me, that's that conversation about kind of the preventative side of how do we build a foundation that will help us withstand the trauma we're going to see inevitably in our line of work, and be able to keep coming back and serving our communities.
Yeah. We always talk about resiliency in the fact that to be resilient is to have something to come back to realign to when you get knocked down, because we're all going to get knocked down. So the question is, do you have that, that place, that point, that kind of post in the distance that you realign to? Otherwise, when you do get knocked down, you look around and go, what do I do now? And I think that's where so many people find themselves, is they get knocked down, they're going to, but they don't have anything to align to beyond that.
Right. One thing I recently taught, I was invited to speak at a conference for peer support in the fire service in Chicago, and they asked me to come in and speak on the subject of faith in the fire service, which I thought, that's an awesome opportunity. Who in the world is going to sign up to sit through a class on faith in the fire service? But it was awesome. It was I was able to teach it for 2 different days and had really good feedback from believers and non-believers alike. But one of the points that I made in that is, again, we live in a culture that I would say is very much becoming a secular society where we embrace, a lot of evolutionary teaching. And so basically, here's the thought. We've been told and taught, our worldview says we came from nothing and nowhere. There was no creator, no designer. There's no
Right.
purpose in our creation or in getting here. We came from nothing and nowhere. We're going to nothing and nowhere and no one, right? So our question of origin, where did we come from? Nowhere. Where are we going? Our question of destiny, nowhere, nothing. And then with that worldview, trying to come to some sense of purpose in this life, it's really hard to answer that question of purpose of why am I here if I have that worldview that says there's nothing before me and there's nothing after me.
Right.
And so you talk about that foundation of resilience. That's where, to me, faith helps answer some of those questions of purpose. And again, different religions have a different answer for that, and we can have a kind discussion about, the various tenets of different worldviews and faith. But still, a faith will provide that tool in the toolbox, if you will, for the first responder community. It will help answer some of those questions of purpose. Why am I here? And it'll help me remember, why did I get into this in the first place? Because there's times in the first responder world where, at least me, maybe others don't feel this way, but I look around and go, why did I sign up for this? This is, right. And it's that sense of purpose and calling that brings me back to that I'm a part of something that's bigger than myself, So yeah, I don't know how people do it without that, to be honest.
People seem to think that in order to deal with trauma, I need to get past it. You hear that kind of language, or I need to get over it, or I need to leave it in the past, or whatever. The reality is, you're not going to forget something traumatic that's happened. There will be those scenes in the first responder world, right? As a police officer, firefighter, and EMT, those scenes that you'll remember for the rest of your life. You close your eyes and you'll remember those things. It's not about forgetting. It's not even about getting over those things. It's about moving forward in spite of them, not letting them define you. But how do you do that if you don't have a direction? And so that's, again, when we're talking to veterans, what we say is, if there's a creator, and we believe there is, if there's a creator, then there is a plan. There was creation and there's a plan. And if we'll simply align to that plan, which we find in Scripture, if we'll align to that plan, it's not that the past goes away or that we forget it or whatever. It's that we can continue to move the direction that we were designed or created to move. And I don't know, to me personally, that's a really liberating feeling to know that I don't have to control it or forget it or get over it or, whatever. I don't have to deal with it anymore. I can continue to move forward. It loses its grip on me. And that message is so important. But how do you communicate that message to someone that, doesn't go to your church or doesn't maybe ascribe to that?
Yeah, well, so and that's a good question, because a lot of times I don't lead with the God card, if you will, because people aren't either there, they're not ready to hear that. So setting the spiritual element aside, I think there's still tools that, and again, my worldview says that it all comes from God anyway, so His truth is true whether you accept it or not. Right, so right. I love the F word that turns so many firefighters off. It's the one F word we don't use a lot, and that's the word feelings. To be in touch. This is going to sound so not masculine, but to be in touch with my feelings, not in a let's all sit around and sing Kumbaya and give each other hugs away, but to know what my emotions are telling me. And to like you said, when I experience trauma, I don't have to pretend I didn't see it, or I don't have to somehow get over it to where I'll never think about it again, but to say, yep, that happened. I saw that, and this is how it felt. This felt, and then to be able to say, I felt fear, I felt anger, I felt despair, whatever it may be, and to say it, to call it out, and then that helps me move forward with that. It helps me to put it in its proper place. And again, going back to what you're saying, that bigger, this is going to get really deep here, but my worldview would tell me that I agree with what you said. There's a creator and there's a plan, but here's where this is a problem for some people, because they would look at that then and go, okay, so you're telling me there's a God that created all this, so yet you say He's loving and powerful and good. So tell me then, why are we seeing war in our world today? Why are we seeing children suffering under oppression? Why are we seeing kids dying of cancer? Why do we see this and that? And so it's a really good distinction to make, that just because something is happening doesn't mean that this God is causing it all. Some things God is allowing to happen that even are against His will, because he's given us all free will. But what we can know is that He is working behind the scenes ultimately for our good. And that even gets twisted sometimes, where people say, so you're telling me this is good? No, I didn't say that the trauma you experienced was good. What I'm saying, or what Scripture is saying, is that there's a God above it all who can work good out of that. He can bring this broken things out of this broken, evil world,
Yeah.
and he can bring them about for my good. So again, trauma, how can that produce good in my life? Well, it can help me take what was intended as nothing but evil and loss and grief, and I can actually use this as a platform to bring hope and healing into other people's lives because I experienced it in my own life. So yeah, it's about, here's a buzzword in our community, like instead of post-traumatic stress disorder, we hear a lot about that, but it's this idea of post-traumatic growth, that in the aftermath of a traumatic, stressful injury, I can actually grow stronger from it. And like a bone is broken and can heal stronger, that can happen with us as well, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Like we're not just forever sentenced to this label of, oh, I'm a PTSD, I have that label and that's what I'm going to suffer with the rest of my life. There's actually growth that's possible for us in the aftermath of that.
Yeah, the idea of becoming a victim is something, again, I speak for the veteran community, or as someone who watches the veteran community. This idea of victimhood is something that we have got to fight against. And I think it's true elsewhere. General Mattis, we use a quote of his when he was giving a speech. General James Mattis was giving a speech, and he talks about post-traumatic stress. And he calls it this post-traumatic growth. And he talks about how, beyond trauma, we can become more compassionate and more caring and more outward focused if we'll allow ourselves to be that. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. There is the potential for someone who has dealt with trauma and dealt with life's difficulties to care more for others if only they'll allow that to happen. What we tend to do, though, is let that trauma turn us inward.
Mm-hmm.
So then we ask those questions. Well, if there's a loving God, why would he allow this to happen to me? And that's what we mean, right?
Right.
We don't mean to other people. We mean to me.
Right.
I've heard it said that there was only one perfect person who ever lived on the earth, and he was murdered. That was Jesus, and that's right. But out of that murder of our Savior came life and health and growth and redemption. So to focus on the brokenness and to focus on the hurt, that's the wrong focus. Why do these things happen? I don't always know the answer. I mean, I have some answers. I don't always know the answer.
Right.
But the point is, it did. And the question is, what will you do now?
Yeah.
Move past that.
Well, and again, like we had a mission before the trauma, right? Like it was the mission that drew you to it. For most of us, I think most people enter into this realm for pure reasons. Not everybody, but most of us are here because we want to help people. We really believe the romanticism about the job that we do. We serve our fellow man. We're here for one another. So it was a mission that called us to this in the first place. That mission doesn't go away just because I've experienced trauma. But there's probably two wrong responses. One you mentioned is that inward response of self-pity and I'm a victim. And that just speaks to our culture as a whole. In our culture, we are a culture full of victims. Right. And I think every profession finds a way to put themselves at the center of that. You should feel sorry for me. I'm entitled to whatever it may be. I see that in the first responder community. And the other probably response is one of just minimizing or denying the trauma. That didn't hurt. That doesn't affect me. Get over it. Suck it up, buttercup. That's not the answer either. Because that's not what you're saying. When I heard you talk about post-traumatic growth, that's not saying, hey, minimize it. It didn't hurt. You should be stronger than that. It's saying, no, that actually did hurt. We live in a broken world, but instead of sitting down and feeling sorry for myself and quitting, I'm going to get the help that I need. I'm going to treat this traumatic injury to my brain no different than I would a traumatic injury to my body. I need to take a time out. I need to get some healing and get back on my feet and get back to the mission, because that's really what it is. We need to overcome that stigma that there's really a difference between me breaking a leg on, well, I'll use a much less analogy. You probably can't see it in the video, but I just took workman's comp. I got sent home from the fire station the other day because I almost cut the tip of my thumb off. I wish I could tell you it was something heroic, like rescuing 3 kids from a burning building. I was cutting rhubarb in the kitchen and about sliced my finger off. So they sent me to the emergency room and got it glued back up. And then they put this fat bandage on it and then sent me home because I couldn't put my glove on. So not a very manly injury. But nonetheless, no one made fun of me for the fact that, well, you probably can't do the job today because you need to put a glove on if we get a fire. No one made fun of me except for the fact that I cut myself with a knife, because we all recognize the physical injury. And in the mental, emotional, spiritual realm, we need to get to the same place of breaking down that stigma to go, nope, you're hurt right now. We see that, but you're not a victim. Like, there is growth in life beyond this. The thumb will heal, and I'll be back to fight fires again another day. And your heart can heal, your mind can heal, your spirit can heal as well. And you don't have to sit down in the path and wear a label for the rest of your life that takes you out of this calling. You can get better, and you can come back to it in some way, shape, or form and help others. So yeah, I think that's a good message, to reject that victim mentality. It's so rampant in our society, and it's kind of sad when we see it in our warriors, whether that's our veterans or whether it's our first responders, because if anybody should not be a victim, it should be those of us who understand we signed up to serve, and we knew that with that came a whole list of putting others in front of ourselves.
It's crazy. I think one of the things that we deal with, and I'm sure you've had the same conversations, typically when there's a physical injury, there's a desire to get better. You want to heal, you want to get better, you want to get back to work or whatever. The spiritual and emotional injuries, though, often there's an identification with that injury, not just victimhood, but this is now who I am. Mm-hmm. I'm this person who's been hurt, or this person who's been traumatized. And I think often one of my struggles is getting someone to realize not only can you get better, but you should desire to get better. Stop identifying with the brokenness and move toward that health and that healing. And man, it's amazing how many people, although they may not say it this way, they don't really want to get better because there's such a strong emotional and maybe even spiritual attachment to that hurt. Is that something that you experience?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, I'll just give a little shameless plug for my podcast, but I'll tell you what the meaning is. So I host this podcast called The Fire Inside, and it's really about peer support in the first responder community and breaking down that stigma and just sharing stories of resilience and people thriving through different difficult situations. But the name of the podcast has kind of a dual connotation. The fire inside, the positive part of that speaks to that purity inside us that calls us for the right reason. Like, let's stoke that healthy fire in our hearts that keeps us going. But the more negative connotation is when we're injured, traumatically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, there's a fire inside. And I use an analogy from the fire service of overhaul. When we go in and put out a house fire, we knock the flames down. Every fireman knows the fire's not out. It's not out until we start peeling back the layers of that structure and getting down to those smoldering embers that burn beneath. So when you talk about the difference between a physical injury and an internal one, not only is the physical one easier to see, and I want my arm to get better so I can use it. I can see that it's broken and it's not functioning. There's a fear that comes with those unseen internal things. There's a fear about peeling back those layers and getting down to that fire inside, if you will, because of fear of what I'm going to have to face. And here's, again, just this weird dichotomy in that, and it's probably true in the veteran community as well. I know for a fact in the first responder community, you're dealing with primarily a very male-dominated profession, but certainly we have a number of amazing females that do the job as well. But you're dealing with a group of men and women that can look fear in the eye and put themselves in harm's way for their fellow man and enter into the fight, if you will, of fighting that fire or that dangerous situation. And yet these same strong men are very unwilling to face that fear in the eye when it's taking a look inside and addressing those deep wounds that are behind, even behind the trauma itself. It isn't even just about that bad call I was on. It was about the fact that this father wound I'm carrying with me from early childhood and how that trauma speaks to that or whatever. And so I often call men out, whether it's in preaching in the, from the pulpit, or whether it's in just my interactions with men in the fire service, that we have this, our society has this, idea of masculinity we like to hold up of big, strong, tough guys that watch sport and drive big trucks and drink beer. And that's fine. Like, I like that part of being a guy, but real masculinity is having the courage to look those things in the eye that would be much easier just to be passive. And in your case, like you're saying, be a victim, because that works too. I'll play the victim card, and then that gives me a pass not to have to face those fears. And so I call men to a higher standard than that and call them to courage. If you're brave enough to face down fire, or if you're brave enough to enter into combat where bullets are flying, you ought to have the courage to be able to look inside your life and face some of these demons that are there. And we all have them, so let's just be honest about it and look at it and talk about it.
Yeah, that's good. Can you talk for a few minutes about the families of first responders? This is, again, very interesting area to me. I don't know what the divorce rates are amongst those who serve in the first responder community, um, but it's high.
Yeah,
and,
it's above average for sure.
and even where there's not divorce, there are a lot of marital issues. Just because two people are legally married doesn't mean they have a happy relationship. And I think there are a lot of factors there. One is just time. Police officers work crazy shifts, and they work nights and then come back and work days. And so it is in the fire service, where you're gone for 2 or 3 days at a time. Here in California, and it's probably the same where you are, but here in California, we have a lot of wildfires. And so city firefighters are part of teams that will go and fight these fires as well. So they can be deployed for months at a time over the year. And just that time away from their families causes tremendous stress. And then the things that they're dealing with, the things that they see, all of it combined. When you're talking to a husband or a wife, again, maybe, the lady that's working at the firehouse and then coming home to a family, or whatever the case, doesn't matter. When you're dealing with these things, what are maybe some of the principal things that you would say, if you want to survive as a husband, as a wife, as a family, if you want these relationships to grow and thrive instead of falling apart, you need to do these things. What are some of those things that you would share with a firefighter?
Yeah, that's good. And you're right. The marriages fail at a higher rate than the rest of the civilian world, because we would all agree marriage is hard. If you've been married longer than 5 minutes, it's hard, just right in and of itself. But then you add some of those things like the sleep deprivation that comes with the job, the time away, the trauma that we're exposed to that we don't necessarily want to come home and dump all that on our families. All of that just compounds those areas. But my challenge and ironically enough, I just finished doing a little marriage series, like a 7-week mini series on my podcast, where essentially I preached about how to have a healthy marriage. Because again, I believe that we do have a roadmap. My worldview informs me that there is a God who designed the family. It was his idea. He created it, and he's given us some commands to follow, that if we follow his roadmap, we kind of have a manual for how to have a marriage that's healthy. But practically speaking, what some of that roadmap would show us is for husbands and wives to learn how to communicate, to learn how to put those expectations out there and just be able to speak truthfully about the challenges that this job is bringing into our family, or the added stress. So we have to learn how to communicate. If I'm speaking to men, I would call them toward that sacrificial love, that even though you're coming home from a 24-hour shift and you're tired and you were up all night and you saw, a horrible accident involving a child, to be able to communicate that enough to your wife that, look, I need to get a nap, I need to get some rest, we had a rough night, but yet to still realize I'm here to serve, that I'm not a victim. I still am being called to lovingly, sacrificially serve my wife and my family. And that goes both ways. Again, there's times where I think the firefighter's family needs to serve the firefighter, right? Like, because our home needs to be that place of strength and support. I would speak to those couples about the need for a healthy sex life, and I know this is a family show, so I'll keep it kind of PG, but the need to connect that way, and then that goes down a whole road as men. How I fight for my own sex life, how to have a healthy sex life. You're not going to have your healthy sex life when you're looking at porn, when you're addicted to that, when your mind and eye is constantly wandering in other directions. Like you're fighting against the unity and intimacy of your own marriage. So, I would just challenge couples down that road to understand, not only is marriage difficult, but you've got added challenges that are going to come with it now with this profession. You're going to have some blessings that come with it too, that the job provides, but certainly it's going to bring a host of issues, and you need to be heads up about it. You need to be talking about it.
I feel like our families are at their core pretty gracious. They, again, talking to even active duty service members who deploy, I think they're pretty gracious. They get that they're married to someone who has a job that takes them away and all of those things. Where a lot of that breaks down, though, is when you come home and you're not really home, or
Right.
you're not at work anymore, but you're out doing something else. And yeah, I love what you said there. It's continued service. Now you're serving your family, and
Right.
yeah, that's so important. Um, there's a lot that goes on along with that. But I've been told before, well, this is my job. I don't have a choice. I have to do this, and my family needs to understand. One of the things I think that's important to understand, and maybe you can speak to this, is you always have a choice. It may be a priority choice, but you always have a choice. You can either learn to serve your family or get another job. And
Mhm.
again, that's not maybe a popular thing to say, but you have a choice. You're just deciding to either give the time you have to your family, or not, or make your job the priority over your family. These are choices that you have. No one takes that away from you, and you get to
Yeah,
decide what you do with that.
100% agree with you, and really this could span to multiple professions, but there's certain professions that lend themselves to the identity crisis, and what I mean by that is, for first responders, it's very easy for us to get our identity from our vocation. It happens in ministry too, that if we're not careful in ministry, pastors can get all consumed with ministry, and they give, you hear about pastors having an affair with the church, with the bride of Christ, like
Right.
they gave all of themselves to the church and at the neglect and expense of their family. So that's a very good point you bring up. I would challenge the first responder community to remember your first family. And this, you need to just get this, guys. When you retire, that day is coming that all of us will step away from the vocation. Here's the brutal facts. Your department is going to roll on the next day as if you did not exist. They are ready for that, and they are going to continue to provide service and coverage to your community completely without you, and they're not going to miss much once you're gone. And I'm not saying that to be unkind. I heard someone say this a while back, that they gave so much of their love to a profession that never loved them back. And as much as we love our job, and I love the fire service, that profession never loves me back. And when I'm on my deathbed, if Lord willing, it's many years from now, and I'm looking back over the years of a full life, the truth is the fire service is not going to be at my bedside. There might be a couple relationships there, from relationships I mentored along the way and cultivated. But the truth is, by and large, most of the men and women I work with right now, on my fire department, they're not going to be at my deathbed. But Lord willing, my family will be. But if I neglect my first family for my second family at the fire station, and it is a family, I mean, it is like we're with each other for a third of our life. But if I neglect my first family for them, I'm going to lose it all, because you're going to lose your fire family at some point in large degree. You're going to lose them. You're not going to be there every single day, having 24 hours of your life with them. You're going to lose that place around the supper table, the coffee table. You're going to lose your spot on the truck to a younger, healthier guy. That day is coming for all of us. And when we walk away from that, are you going to have a family waiting by your side, that still loves you because you've invested into your wife or your husband and your kids? So that's a huge message. And the sooner we learn that, the better our lives will be. How sad when we see so many first responders throwing away their first family, and then their second family, and then their third family at the altar of the fire family and that calling, because it's never going to love you back. So very good point.
What you have a unique perspective on this. So, what are some ways that the church can serve the first responder community? I think this is um, one of those areas the church struggles with, and it's funny to me, having been in church ministry and having been, now in parachurch ministry, kind of on the outside, and I'm very involved with our church, but I'm not in leadership. I think sometimes first responders and maybe the veterans or service members in the community, they look at a church and say, they don't understand me. They don't really care about serving me or whatever. They want something from me. I can't speak for every church, um, but I would say by and large, that's not the case. The church is in the community to serve the community. And part of that is the active duty folks that live there, where I live, or the first responders that live in the community. But truly, the church doesn't always know how to do that. What are some ways that the local church can support the first responder community? Some things, I don't know, practical things. Maybe it's a ministry, maybe it's um, caring for the family? I don't know what, from your perspective, because again, you have a very unique perspective on this.
Yeah, and so I'm going to say two things. One, I promise will be offensive if there's religious people listening. This is not going to sit well with certain people probably in the audience. Right. And then I'll give one that's a little more generic. But so here's the thing, and I say this as someone who's grown up in the church, and I love the church, and I pastor the church. But one thing, if I could just speak to all of the churches across America today, I would say if you want to serve certain professions like the first responder, law enforcement, military, and just men in general, because again, these are heavily male-dominated professions, I would say the church as a whole could use a good shot of Jesus masculinity. And again, I know I'm opening a can of worms and I'm going to offend some people, and we probably don't have time to fully unpack this, but so many churches today are built in such a way that do not celebrate and reward God-given strength and risk-taking and entrepreneurship and masculinity. We actually, as a church, we squash a lot of that, and we like safe and predictable and traditional. And not that there's anything wrong with those things, but what happens is today, I'm just speaking very generic terms. I know there's exceptions to this, but if you walked into the average church in North America today and looked around, you would be hard-pressed to find a tough, strong firefighter, combat veteran, police officer, because they don't feel like they fit in the church. So one way, if you want to serve that community, is start being a church that embraces real masculinity in all of its dangerousness and risk-taking and all of that. So again, there's books out there on this subject that are certain to offend people further than I already have. But go ahead.
Stop there. What are some ways to do that? So we're told that 70% of churchgoers in America are women. 70%. Mm-hmm. And we love women. I'm married to one. I've got a couple others in my house. I love women. We love women. But that does cause the church then to be kind of shaped in a way that appeals to women. So I think that's true across the board. But what are some ways that a church then can celebrate masculinity and do what you've said? I mean, what does that look like? Let me say this, because this is something that, again, watching churches, I feel like a church goes one way or the other. It either gets into the celebrating the silliness of masculinity and, that conversation around toxic masculinity. I feel like some churches have just embraced the toxic masculinity, obnoxious, and I know that's not what you're talking about. Right. Then there's the other side where it's, almost a feminine approach to church. How do you rightly celebrate masculinity in a way that's healthy and positive and encouraging? How do you do that?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I don't want to pretend I have the answers on all of it, but without apology, I'm just going to say it bluntly. Like if there was a thermostat, I say this to our leadership and to our staff in the church that I lead. If there's a thermostat that on one side is strong feminine qualities and the other side is strong masculinity, without apology, I want the needle of that thermostat to tip in the direction of masculinity. Not saying that, boys rule, girls drool. And shout out to the women. If the women in the church today stopped serving, the church would come to a grinding halt, because women are the ones stepping up and leading and volunteering and serving and leading their families to church. That's partly good and partly not good on the guys, right? So this is not about boys are better than girls. It isn't that. What that looks like, and by the way, to the toxic masculinity, just today in a group of pastors on Facebook, someone was asking it with Father's Day soon around the corner, hey, what are you giving to the dads at Father's Day? And it's, we're doing bacon and we're giving Slim Jims. And again, it's this idea that men are just these meat-eating, we're going to have a farting contest in church. No one actually said that, but it's that, and I just roll my eyes going, that's not, anyway, what it looks like in our church is this, like, we're going to be intentional about the ambiance of the room. So I'm not a big fan of big floral decorations and doilies and religious artwork hanging on the wall. Again, if you love that, that's great. You might have had that in your church growing up. We're going to downplay the dress. Most average men don't love to put on a suit and tie and come to church. So I'm going to lead in that, and we're going to be casual in our dress. When I preach as a man, I'm going to hit issues head on, and I'm going to say it like it is, because I think men respect that clarity I'm not going to tiptoe around the issues. I'm not going to be a jerk when I preach, but I'm just going to put it out there. This is God's truth, and you can take it or leave it, but I'm going to call you to action. I'm going to call you to commitment. I'm going to call you to repentance. We're not going to shy away from the hard things. We're going to talk about issues that absolutely require courage. We're going to point out the areas in our world where we need some God-given men to get rightly indignant and pissed off about some things in our world and call men to it. I think that resonates with men, and I think it helps to be a man yourself. Like, so I'm not saying that you have to drive a big I drive a Toyota Camry. I used to have a pickup, but now I drive a Toyota Camry. Okay.
As long as it's not a Prius.
Right. No Prius. Heck no. I'm not anyway. But I share stories about hunting. I share stories about, football. I try to relate to men and create an environment where when the average guy walks in off the street, he goes, okay, I feel comfortable here. Now, I take that as one of the biggest compliments over the years in ministry, where I've had women tell me, I could never get my husband to come to church, but he loves coming here. Because what that tells me is we're speaking to men on a level that maybe they haven't been exposed to in their traditional church setting growing up. So we just try to keep men in mind with this belief that if we reach the man, if we get the husband, the father, we're going to get the wife and children most of the time as well. If we cater to the women and children primarily, dad's going to stay away. And then the kids are going to follow dad's footsteps and also stay away when they're at an age of making that decision for themselves. So it's without apology that, and again, we have women in leadership, we have women on our stage, we have women on our staff. But again, I want people to see strong, masculine men up front leading. I want them to see that without apology, because it kind of is counter to what we see in our culture today. So I don't know, that's not a full and complete answer, but at least kind of tips my hat to what I mean when I talk about, you asked the question, how can churches serve this community? Man, if there were more churches like that, I'll tell you what, quick story. The guy who connected me to your ministry, to Mighty Oaks, who was a guest right here on my podcast, I work with him on my fire department, and God used your ministry to touch his life and introduce him to Christ. He is a classic example, because he would get nothing from church. He would attend a church service, and it just did not speak to his heart. And again, some of that was because he had bigger walls built up, and he needed a community like yours to speak into that. But yet I would contend there's probably a certain style of church that probably could have started tearing those walls down a little sooner. But he goes, if you step into the average church, you're not going to find that. You're going to find a place where that profile of a man goes, I don't fit here. These are not my people. This is not my tribe. They don't get me. And so that would be the first thing I would say to that. The second, the more generic answer is this, that the church needs, the best thing the church can do to help that community or any other is to be an equipping and sending station. And here's what I mean by that. The best ministry to my fire department, quite frankly, is putting me in their midst, right? Because I'm one of them. Our community, when we see religious people coming from the outside, a chaplain wearing a cross or a collar, we immediately have a wall that goes up, right? Because not only are you not one of us, but now you represent religion to me, and that can mean a whole lot of different things to different people. So the best thing the church can do is infiltrate that community with our own, and send our people out into the world. So whatever your part of the world is, if it's combat veterans, go there. If it's the insurance industry, go there. If it's the school, go there. And if our church is recognized, we're not just a gathering station, we are a sending station where we come here, get equipped, get trained up, and then we get sent out. So I hope, and I've had to battle through this a little bit with my church, and I know it's a non-traditional story of a full-time pastor going back into a full-time, job outside of his church. Most of our church has been very supportive of it, but I hope that my church understands this is ministry just as much as Jon's doing ministry when he's preaching on the stage. It's just as valid ministry when we send him out into the fire station to rub shoulders, and he can meet them on their turf and speak their language. So again, that's a generic answer, but truly, I don't see one church being able to reach all these people by gathering. I see the church being able to serve those communities by sending our people into them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think that's to your earlier point about vocational ministry. What is ministry? Ministry is serving. Ministry is doing what God's called you to. And I've had this conversation a number of times with young people getting ready to go into the military. I was an infantry officer in the Marine Corps. I was not a chaplain, and I feel like God used my time with those guys in a way that I would not have been used if I was a chaplain. Now, I'm very thankful for chaplains; they do great work. But
Yep.
for me, it wasn't that. My ministry was serving the guys that God put in my unit and around me. And so, yeah, absolutely, it's understanding ministry is everywhere and being that where God places you.
Yeah, that's our department. Like many, we have both a chaplains team, which I kind of am. I'm not a chaplain, but I serve on that team. But then we also have a peer support team. And quite frankly, more of my energy and effort goes into that peer support, because the idea of
Right.
peer support is it's our own helping our own.
Right.
And I have way more doors open to me just by being one of the guys, if you will, versus the title that comes with a chaplain. And what I tell chaplains, and it's probably true in military as well, you almost have an extra hurdle to overcome as a chaplain, because you
Right.
got to live down that title, the cross, the collar, whatever it is. You've got to actually work to get through that, to build a relationship that automatically I have given to, well, not automatically, but it's much more easily given when it's like he's one of us. He's on the crew. He understands what we're seeing. He's a part of it. So
Yeah, that's awesome, John. I think we could talk for probably another hour, and maybe we'll get a chance to do that.
I'd love it.
For those that are watching or listening, name your podcast and some other places people can follow you and really get to know what you guys do.
Yeah, the best way to reach me, the website for my podcast is thefireinsidepodcast.com. The name of the podcast is the Fire Inside Podcast, so .com. And then once you go there, all the links to my social media, you can email me directly through there, subscribe to the podcast. I'd love to connect and serve in any way that I can with anyone in your audience. So thanks for the opportunity for letting me share that.
Absolutely. Your church and the city where your church is located. We've got folks listening from all over the place.
Absolutely. The name of my church is The Rescue Church, and our website is therescuechurch.com. We're located, our original location, our home office is in Flandreau, South Dakota. Flandreau is a little town of about 2,300 people, about 40 minutes north of Sioux Falls. So Sioux Falls is kind of the one big recognizable city in the state of South Dakota, and we're about 40 minutes north of that. So rural, kind of small town rural is our focus in the church side of things. And then I get this crazy opportunity to serve firefighters in the big city. So I love it.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much, and look forward to the next time we can talk. Be great.
Been my pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, sir. And for those of you that are watching, thank you for watching. Every Friday at 10 a.m., you can find us on YouTube, and we'll put this episode and other episodes up. If you haven't subscribed yet, you need to subscribe. Hit also the notification bell. That lets you know when new episodes come online, and we'd love to stay connected to you that way. And for those of you that are listening to the podcast or listening to our radio show on Mojo 50, thank you for listening. Jump over to our YouTube page and check that out. A lot of great videos there, and look forward to connecting with you there. Thanks for watching.